Hey guys, welcome to our first video for Unit 7. This is going to be all about Congress, which is our final institution of government. So we're looking at the legislative branch, and we're going to spend this video looking at the basics of Congress, differentiating between Congress's enumerated or expressed powers and their implied powers. We're going to be looking at how Congress, the Congress that we know today came to be, and a little bit about what it does, as well as the differences in structure and function of the portions of Congress or the chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. So we're going to get started here now. Okay, so to start, we have to go all the way back to the beginning and thinking about how our founding fathers wanted to consider adequate representation. And we have to go back to the Constitutional Convention for this. If you remember, all the way back to Unit 1, after the Revolutionary War with Britain, right, we were concerned about adequate citizenship and representation. And then especially with that disastrous Articles of Confederation, we wanted to balance representation of the people, the states, and make sure that everyone was fairly represented in government. And just like everything in government, compromise is key. Now, if you remember, we're going to go over these again, but the compromise that leads to Congress starts out at these two plans. So the Virginia plan originally was proposed by Virginia, of course, and the bigger states. And this plan, the cornerstone of this plan ultimately was to base representation on population, right? It should be based on population, bigger states having more representation in Congress. Now, on the other hand, the New Jersey plan was presented by small states, and they said, whoa, wait a minute, we don't want to be represented based on population because we would lose out, we're smaller. We want representation to be equal. So what happens is we end up with the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And this leads to what we have today, which is a bicameral Congress. And bicameralism simply means that the legislature is divided into two separate bodies. Ultimately, this is what we have today. But as we were debating about the Constitution, right, the intent was, how do we balance small and large states? And this is going to be a product of concern for anti-federalists that we see Madison trying to ease in Federalist 51, right? Our goal was to make sure that this created a system of checks and balances, opposing concentration of power into a single institution like a king, so that way we didn't have tyranny and abuse of power. So Congress, as we know it, is outlined in Article 1 of the Constitution. And in Article 1 specifically, this is a pretty long article, it's going to outline the bicameral nature of Congress. So it's going to say that there is a House of Representatives. It's also going to then outline the Senate as well. Now, we are going to be talking about these a little bit more in depth in this video, specifically how they're set up, their structure, as well as their function and their powers, as well as the rest of the unit. But the big thing here to remember is that these two chambers, as they're called, of Congress, are built on this principle of checks and balances, right? Legislation, as we will see, must go through both of these chambers, and that prevents the passage of rash laws or laws that don't make sense for the entire country. Laws being made too quickly could be detrimental. So this bicameral nature helps bring checks and balances, helps balance this idea of majority rule and minority rights that our framers were so concerned about. Now, we are currently in the 117th Congress, and a new session takes place every 2 years. And usually we do see some shakeup in terms of the party that controls each chamber. So in the 117th Congress, currently the House is a Democratic majority, or composed of a Democratic majority, meaning there are more Democrats than Republicans. Now the Senate is not so simple. The Senate currently is tied 50-50. So there are 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. However, politicians do consider the Senate to be a Democratic majority because of the tie-breaking vote that the vice president brings in. And since we have a Democratic vice president, right, odds are she will vote on the Democratic side of things. Now, this has evolved over time, as I mentioned. Usually, we do see a shakeup of the composition of Congress, but Congress itself has evolved over time too, and has become increasingly diverse. We've even seen a transition from temporary politicians to more career politicians, right? People being in these positions of power for decades. Congress, how they function has changed as well as a result of a recent-ish shift to more of a distrust in government. That's kind of changed how Congress has operated. Congress meets in the Capitol building, which is what you see here. And in total, Congress has 535 voting members. That number is static. So the 435 members, as we will see, of the House, that is by law, and 100 members of the Senate, that is in the Constitution. There are also 6 non-voting members, and if you're wondering where these non-voting members come from, they're from territories of the U.S., like Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, even Washington, D.C., since Washington, D.C. does not vote in Congress. They only have votes in the Electoral College. All right, so let's talk about life in Congress very quickly here. On average, the salary of a congressperson is about $174,000 a year plus retirement benefits. They are government employees. They get a pension. Now, your leadership in Congress does make a little bit more. About $193,000 for those leaders, $223,500 for the Speaker of the House. So as you can see, it kind of ranges, but they do make a good salary here. Now, I want to mention the 27th Amendment. And the 27th Amendment, since Congress sets their own salary, the 27th Amendment prohibits any law that increases or decreases the salary of members of Congress from taking effect until the start of the next set of terms for those representatives. So the idea is, yeah, we can pay ourselves, but just not right now, right? And that's kind of saving Congress from a little bit of corruption, raising pay while they're still in office. Instead, they're not guaranteed to be reelected, so they have to wait until the next set of terms. So, and again, this salary is also tempered by the presidential veto and voter backlash as well, which prevents Congress from increasing pay exponentially. Just some other perks. Congress receives free parking, low-cost medical care, pensions, free printing, distribution of papers. We call this the franking privilege. And all of this franking privilege comes in handy when it comes to re-election. They also have a personal staff, on average about 22 people. And ultimately, this is a very demanding job, requiring 10 to 14-hour days, time away from family, pressure from the public. And what we've seen is a lot of backlash surrounding the personal and professional backgrounds of Congress. Ultimately, Congress today is not entirely representative of the American public. The average member is white, male, mid-50s. Most are married with children. Most are Christian. Most, are lawyers. And like I said, it is more diverse than it's ever been, but it still is not representative of the entire American public. So what does Congress actually do? We first need to start out with the Constitution and the powers that are given to it in the Constitution. Now, we have this idea of enumerated and expressed powers versus implied powers. To start, enumerated powers are specific powers granted to Congress, expressly written down in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. There are 18 of these total, and we will explore those in class. Now, on the other hand, implied powers are powers not explicitly named in the Constitution, but are assumed or implied to exist due to them being necessary to implement these powers here, these expressed powers. And this establishes what we call the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. And ultimately, this clause here has led to Congress being able to address a wide range of issues, ranging from economic, social, and environmental. So I want to give you guys an example of what these two powers kind of look like here. So an enumerated power of Congress, first, is Congress can lay and collect taxes, okay? Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it mention anything about people not paying taxes and punishment for that, right? If there is no punishment for not paying your taxes, people are not going to pay taxes. So an implied power of Congress would be to punish those who evade taxes. Okay. Another example, enumerated power of Congress would be coining money. And as we've seen in a court case, McCullough versus Maryland, an implied power that comes from or is required of Congress, necessary of Congress to carry out that power of coining money, is to regulate a national bank. Now, advancements in society, Supreme Court interpretations, altered expectations of government have greatly expanded congressional authority over time, and we continue to see this being the case in today's government. As we've mentioned, Congress also is in charge of representing the will of the people, and we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit differently in terms of the House and the Senate in a bit. Congress is also in charge of lawmaking, right? Congress, the legislative branch, legislates, makes laws. Now, they're not the only branch that necessarily does this, but they are the formal branch. As we've talked about, there are other institutions that do have certain lawmaking-esque abilities. I'm thinking of executive orders with the president, bureaucrats having those quasi-legislative rules, the Supreme Court rendering opinions and decisions and precedents that have the force of law. But ultimately, bills and laws begin with Congress. And Congress also checks the other branches of government. That is one of the biggest things that it does. And we've talked about checks and balances, partly here investigating operations of other government agencies, overseeing the bureaucracy through the budget, creating agencies themselves, conducting investigations and hearings, conducting legislative oversight. So these are checks on other branches of government, and we will actually see how Congress interacts with these other branches as we move through this unit. Okay, so I'm actually going to pause here for this video, looking at just some basics of Congress. In the next video, we're going to continue our investigation of the structure of Congress, and I'm going to talk about the bicameral design a little bit more, investigating the differences between the House and the Senate. So please stay tuned for the next video. Bye, guys. Now, the bicameral design of our Congress has an interesting metaphor, and we actually have George Washington to thank for this. The House of Representatives is known as the cup, and the Senate is known as the saucer. So it's a very interesting metaphor for the way our Congress functions. The House is originally known as the cup, where you pour your hot beverage like coffee or tea. You have to think about the 1700s. But the House of Representatives is hot because it's more connected to the people and their interests. It's more about passion. And then the Senate is the saucer, right? What you set the hot cup on so you don't burn yourself or whatever you're setting the cup on. So the Senate's the saucer in that it's a little bit more experienced, more cautious, it's consistent, it's a check on the lawmaking process. It's also independent and allows for rational thought and reason. Okay. Now, the House of Representatives is known as the People's House for a couple of different reasons, as we'll explore. So I want to first talk about representation. The House is the House of Representatives is based on population. There are 435 members. And that is reapportioned, meaning it is decided how many representatives a state has every 10 years based on that state's population. And it's every 10 years because that's when we do the census. So as the populations of states change, the number of representatives they have changed. It's predicted in Ohio for 2020, our population has decreased. Therefore, maybe the number of representatives we have in Ohio will decrease as well. The House of Representatives represents what we call a district, and a district is a small geographic area. And this allows for the House to have a more intimate constituent representative relationship, so the relationship between the congressperson and the people that they represent. And ultimately, the House is designed to represent the will of the people. The House has only 2-year terms, and they're up for re-election at the same time. These 2-year terms force representatives to consider the popular opinions of the people that they represent, unless they, be replaced by unsatisfied voters in the next election. So that's part of where this passion comes from, right? There's a lot of quick action. They have to listen to the passions of the people as well. It's not as consistent as we will see with the Senate. Now, the Senate is known as the Millionaires Club. The Senate is seen as more of like an elite body of Congress. And instead of being based on population, the Senate is based on states. So there are 2 senators per state, meaning there are 100 members of the Senate. And that number does not change. That is actually listed in the Constitution. Now, the senators represent their state that they are a resident of. And because they represent a state rather than a district, that means they have a larger geographical area to cover. And that means they have a more diverse electorate or constituency. So they have to address a lot of problems, which is part of the reason why terms are different and structure is different. Now, originally, unlike the House, the Senate was originally chosen by state legislatures. So in the Constitution, prior to the 17th Amendment, they are chosen by the state legislative bodies. What the 17th Amendment does is it actually made the process more democratic during the Progressive era. And this broadens democracy by allowing for the direct election of senators. So yes, currently we elect both the House and the Senate. Now, unlike the House, the Senate has a little bit of longer terms. They have 6-year terms, and unlike the House where they are up for re-election at the same time, the Senate has staggered elections. So a third, 33 seats in the Senate, are up for re-election every 2 years. So the purpose of this, 6-year terms, insulates the Senate from public opinion more than the House. They don't have to worry about being voted out of office so soon. It's more consistent. These staggered elections make it more continuous as well. And if you want to think about this saucer and cup analogy, right? The idea was the Senate was supposed to be the body of uniformity and order for the framers of the Constitution. Now, I also want to talk about requirements for both the House and Senate. So requirements for the House are a little bit different. You can be a little bit younger, 25 years old. You have to be a citizen of the United States and a resident of the United States for the last 7 years. You do not have to live in your district if you are a part of the House of Representatives. So you can live outside of that small geographic area that you represent. Now, when it comes to rules and debate, there is a little bit of difference as well between the House and the Senate. The House has very formal, limited debate, and the reason, quite frankly, is because of its size. With 435 members, there has to be some sort of formal, limited debate to make sure that things can get done at all. For example, there are rules that the House has to follow, being one, that a representative may not speak for more than an hour. Something that creates this formal debate is the House Rules Committee. There is not a Rules Committee in the Senate. This is unique to the House of Representatives. And we will visit this later when we talk about and cover the bill to law process. But essentially what you need to know right now is this Rules Committee establishes the efficiency of the House. It decides how much time a bill can be debated and how many, if any, amendments can be added to a bill, just to make sure that a bill doesn't stay in the House of Representatives for an insanely absurd amount of time. Now, unique to the House is also something called the Committee of the Whole, and again, we'll talk about this in the bill to law process, but ultimately, this is designed to allow longer debates among fewer people. The members of the House vote as a group. It's designed to push things along a little bit quicker. So on the flip side, the Senate requirements are you must be at least 30 years of age, a citizen of the US, so that is similar, but you must be a resident in the US at least 9 years. So there is a little bit more of a requirement there. And differently, you must be a legal resident of your state. So you do have to have a residency requirement to be in the Senate. So you do would, like if you were an Ohio senator, you would have to live in the state of Ohio. Now, rules and debate differences between the House and the Senate, because of its size, is less formal. That means there are some interesting things that can happen when it comes to proposing and passing legislation. The best known is the filibuster. And the purpose of a filibuster is to stall or kill, essentially, a bill, to let time run out on a deadline for voting or to wear down the opposition. You literally talk the bill to death. There are many examples in pop culture and in history. What I've linked here is an example of Ted Cruz from a few years ago. I know there's examples in Parks and Rec. If you've ever seen the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, there's a very famous one. But there are just a few rules when it comes to filibustering. 1, you cannot stop. 2, you cannot take a break. That is pretty much it. I think there's some requirements on like not eating or drinking for a certain amount of time besides water, but you do not in a filibuster have to talk about the bill itself. In a lot of these filibusters, if you were to click on this video, you would see Ted Cruz talking about White Castle and, reading various books. So it does not have to be about your bill as long as you continue talking and stalling. Now, the Senate also has something known as the cloture rule, and this is designed to end this monstrosity of a filibuster. Ultimately, to stop a filibuster, what this means is you just need a simple majority to close up or stop that debate, and ultimately to call for a vote. And this ends the filibuster and ultimately debate on the bill. So this is a way to get around this unlimited debate in the Senate. All right, so now moving on to constitutional differences. There are different powers assigned to each chamber of Congress in the Constitution. So starting in the House, biggest one here is going to be that in the House, all revenue or tax bills originate or are initiated. A senator cannot introduce a tax or revenue bill. And the reason for this is revenue bills they start in the most representative body, right? The House of Representatives is supposed to be closer to the people. It was the body originally elected by the people. So with matters of money, it should start closer to them. Another constitutional difference, the House of Representatives is responsible for selecting the president if there is a tie in the Electoral College or no one receives a vote of 270 votes. And as we've talked about in class, the House of Representatives has the sole power to bring impeachment charges on a federal official. Now, the Senate has a little bit more responsibility when it comes to constitutional power, namely, as we've talked about, the advice and consent power of the Senate. This is that ability to confirm or deny presidential appointments of the president, whether that's cabinet secretaries, federal judges, foreign ambassadors, even U.S. ambassadors to other countries. So this is a really large check on presidential power. And the Senate may even recommend people for positions that they approve. So in this advice and consent of these, bureaucratic positions or ambassadors, secretaries, there is a hearing, and then they decide voting on a simple majority whether that person should be appointed or not. The Senate, unlike the House, has quite a bit of foreign affair powers. So while the president can negotiate treaties with foreign nations, the Senate is what is responsible for approving, ratifying those treaties, or denying them, which has happened. And foreign affairs happens here in the Senate due to the continuity of the Senate, and this was pushed by the Federalists, right? You want these really big decisions to be done by those of the saucer, right? The consistent, uniform, reasonable, quote unquote, branch or section of Congress. And then on the flip side, whereas the House has the sole power to bring or start the impeachment process, the Senate has the sole power of trying that impeached official and deciding if they are acquitted or convicted, as we've mentioned in class.